Three. All right. Talk Theory with Jes and Talita, a social work student's perspective, understanding social learning theory in social work.
Hello, welcome to Talk Theory with Talita and Jes. We are just two social work students talking together to break down some key theories in social work and to help you decide if you will maybe apply them in your real world practice. I'm Talita and oh,
I'm Jes, and today we're diving into social learning theory. Woo! All right, okay. Hold the applause. Let's get into it. Social learning theory, or in short, known as SLT, was developed primarily by American psychologist Albert Bandura in 1952. In today's podcast, we're going to discuss what is learning theory? What does it say? We will also talk about how research supports it and what its relevance can be to social work. And finally, we'll even talk about would we use this theory in our own practice? So, officially, let's get started.
so what is social learning theory? Social learning theory primarily focuses on the interaction between the learning environment, cognition, and behavior in influencing people's learning behavior, emphasizing the significance of the learning environment and individual behavioral factors. So basically, social learning theory explains that people learn behaviors through observation, imitation, and modeling. We don't just learn by doing, we learn by watching others and the consequences of their actions.
That's right. And at the core of social learning theory, it is the idea that a person's behavior is shaped by reinforcement, punishment, and the environment. So think of it. For example, you have a child, they're growing up, and they're surrounded by aggressive behavior. So this aggressive behavior could be a parent, another caregiver, a family member within the home, or maybe even like a role model this kid sees. So if they repeatedly see this aggression that and sees that it gets rewarded, they might adopt some similar behaviors. There is one research experiment that kind of supports this example. It's the Bobo doll experiment, and it was done in 1961 by the American psychologist Albert Bandura. And but we'll get into that a little bit more later in our discussion.
So, to address this, social learning theory suggests that behavioral interventions should focus on positive reinforcement, role modeling, and reconstructing thought patterns. This is where techniques like cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, come in. So there are some key factors of social learning theory. It includes the observational learning. It's a method of learning that consists of observing and modeling another individual's behavior, attitudes, or emotional expressions. Imitation is repeating observed behaviors or to mimic another person's behavior. There's reinforcement and punishment. And these techniques used to change behavior, therefore shaping behavior through consequences. And there's self-efficiency. And
I see.
Albert, what is it called?
Talita, that would be called self-efficacy.
Efficacy. Albert Bandura defined self-efficacy as the belief in one's capabilities to organize and execute the courses of actions required to manage prospective situations. Or another way of putting it is a person needs to act a certain way to get a certain outcome.
Reminds me of
Recip-
my kids.
Nah. Reciprocal determinism, the interaction between a person, their behavior, and their environment. Alvin Bandura states that a person's behavior both influences and is influenced by personal factors or the social environment.
And while Bandura is one of the well-known figures behind social learning theory, other behaviorists helped lay the foundation for social learning theory. And they are behaviorists like B.F. Skinner, which I'm sure we've all heard of, and John B. Watson. Again, Bandura continued and expanded on their work. And what he did is he merged the cognitive process and therefore making social learning theory a bridge between behaviorism and cognitive psychology. Okay, so let's get into what the research says. What does the research say when it comes to social learning theory? So here we are now. There are research studies and experiences that include animals among their interactions with other animals. But there's also experiments that are around humans. But let's talk about some of the following studies that include humans. As we mentioned before, the Bobo doll experiment, which is probably one of the most popular experiments of social learning theory. And, it could be used within substance abuse intervention and also in education. So, social learning theory is pretty adaptive. So, let's talk about the Bobo doll experiment. This was done in 1961 by Bandura. And in this experiment, two groups of children were shown two different videos of an adult playing with a Bobo doll. In one group, the adult was acted kind of aggressive towards the doll. The adult struck the doll with a mallet and kicked it several times. In the other video, the adult had a very different experience with the Bobo doll. The doll was carried around, cared for, and played for gently, and treated kindly. So after that, both groups of children reviewed those videos. They were brought into a room where there just happened to be a Bobo doll, and so the children were then kind of, you know, they were watched by the researchers, and the results showed that the children being observed who saw that the adult was aggressive towards the doll, once they got to play with the doll, were also aggressive. They imitated the adult's social behavior. So, in the other group, the children who watched the video of the adult playing gentle with the doll also imitated that behavior. So, as a parent with two kids myself, this has me thinking about the impact of violent video games and how it plays out on kids. So, yeah, that's one experiment about social learning theory.
Right. And for me, I've been a social worker for a very long time now, and I've seen and dealt with a lot of domestic violence, and worked with a lot of families that, witnessed domestic violence and the children, and then I work with them throughout the years, and you could see how, you know, seeing, these parents behave in a certain way, they felt like they should behave that way.
Yeah, so they're mimicking it almost.
Yes.
And so like that just really kind of has you think about what it is that kids are actually watching on TV and what they're being exposed to. So, especially in your line of work.
Right, exactly. Especially with the video games. I mean, even with adults too, there's some studies out there that, some adults playing a nice amount of video games, I think they talked about like maybe one of the shooters, but they were like mimicking and,
Yeah, well, I can even think too, like, you're in that game, you got the headphones on, you're immersed in that game, and it's very violent and maybe have an aggression. And somebody was to interrupt that person outside of the game, they could snap and be like, "What? What is it you want?" It's because you're so immersed. So, yeah,
yeah.
for me as a parent, it makes me really think about what it is that my kids are playing and being able to have that control over it. So, yeah, so maybe that is a little bit about social learning theory that I'm
Like
practicing in parenting.
Right. And like one last thing that I just saw recently was, with the VR, virtual reality, there's like some kind of equipment that you can step on and like hold a pretend gun and just like be there in real life in a way. Um, but also with social learning, I want to talk to you guys more about, social learning theory and substance abuse interventions. There's been research by Marlette and Gordon in 1985. It demonstrated the reinforcement strategies and behavioral modeling help reduce substance abuse. I think this says like the study gave a way to to the relapse prevention model, these specific interventions identify specific high-risk situations for each client and enhancing the client's skills for coping with those situations, increasing the client's self-efficacy and eliminating myths regarding alcohol effects, and also managing lapse and reconstructing the client's perceptions of the relapse process. The modeling and the imitation strategies are a compromise of balancing the client's lifestyle and holding him or her develop positive addictions, um, and employing stimulus control techniques and urge management techniques and developing a relapse roadmaps.
So yeah, and I used to work in adolescent detox, which, what it was is we were trying to replace those negative behaviors with positive behaviors. And so yeah, I can see how this can be used in substance abuse treatment because it is, it's there. And there we are as residential counselors trying to model that positive behavior too. So yeah, good job, Talita.
Right. I mean, for me, I mean, I've had a lot of clients that they do have a relapse prevention, like a plan, and I could see a lot of changes, and I think it does benefit them a lot having that type of like model.
Okay, so another thing is, social learning theory and education. So I can see this also too, because when I think of social learning theory, I'm kind of thinking of like a role model. And when I think of a role model, I think of kids and adults. So we are, you know, enacting that behavior and hope that they would make good choices, right? So be the leader. Monkey see, monkey do, almost it makes me think of. And, one of the studies is that Dale Shuck, in his book, The Learning Theories, an educational perspective, discusses key learning theories. In this book, it includes social learning theories, key components of observational learning, imitation, modeling, and self efficacy. Shunk was also discusses different levels of development to learn by different methods. So, for example, by observing teacher and peer models, students acquire knowledge that they may not necessarily use immediately. So, like, what I was thinking of and what he mentions in his text is that, you know, teachers, being strapped for time and like they only have so much time in their class, will kind of teach students that skimming. So it's a useful procedure or a useful tool to acquire a little knowledge or kind of get a gist of what the written passage is about. So they may not necessarily show that or use that skill immediately in the class, but when they go back home and they're doing that homework and actually reading some of the textbook material, it can they'll use that as a tool, a resource. So Chuck confirms that students learn more effectively when social reinforcement and modeling is involved. So also kind of what Chuck also said is that depending on the age of a child determines how it is that they may imitate in the model and the self-efficacy of it is. So, you're not going to a 6 month old is not going to learn and be reinforced the same way as a 6 year old is going to be. So that's kind of what Shuck kind of dived into. But, social learning theory does not exist without its critiques. So some scholars, behaviorists included, argue that social learning theory underestimates the biological influences on behavior. So asking the big question, what about genetics? And that comes a question that we hear all the time, nature versus nurture. How does that come into play? And so that's one of the biggest critiques of social learning theory. Others say it also doesn't fully explain the internal motivation of a person. So what it is that drives that person. So yeah, we say self-efficacy and you have to act a certain way in order to get a certain outcome. So, I think about even when I train my dog. He knows if he's going to sit and give paw, he's probably going to get a treat. So, and that benefits him. So, and of course, there are ethical concerns about experiments exposing children to negative behaviors. So, going back to the Bobo doll experiment, and it was exposing children to those violent, aggressive behaviors. It makes me question, would they be able to do this experiment in today's day and age? I don't know.
I think that's a very good question. So, does social learning theory fit in with social work? Now, let's get back to talking about social work and how social learning theory fits in. Is social learning theory a good fit? Yes or no? I would say, in many ways, yes. Um, One way is as it aligns with the key principles of social work, such as empowerment and self efficacy. It widely used in behavioral interventions and it can easily be adapted. Interventions with social learning theory can be used in cognitive behavioral therapy, parenting programs, support programs, rehabilitation, and even corporate training. An example of the corporate training model that incorporates the social learning theory is the 7-20-10 model for learning and development. According to this model, 70% of the learning comes from hands-on experience, 20% comes from social learning, 10% comes from formal training opportunities. This benefits cost savings to corporate agencies, improving culture and learning employee turnover,
Yeah, lowering the employee turnover. So that makes people want to stay within their company.
right? I mean, this does look like a very good model. It helps social workers understand how social structures shape behavior and advocate for policy change. And it supports culturally competent practice, acknowledging how environment and culture influence behavior. At the group level, social learning enables the transmission of behavior between individuals and across generations, in turn providing the opportunity to establish traditions and other cultural experience. However, but because it doesn't emphasize innate psychological processes, it often needs to be supplemented with other theories for a well-rounded approach.
So I guess what it comes down to, Talita, would we use this theory, that is once we graduate and actually venture out and to be social work professionals, so I myself, yeah, absolutely. But just like you mentioned, does it fit in with social work? It's going to have its limitations. So social learning theory is practical and has some strong supported research, and it's effective in its behavioral intervention. And it can, yeah, and it's flexible. It can be adapted to almost any situation or scenario, whether you're working in addiction, in counseling, youth programs, educations. Its principles can be applied in many ways. However, also, as you mentioned, Talita, that before, in order for it to be like a well-rounded approach, you have to pair it with some other theories. So, cognitive approaches. So, in being familiar, I feel like cognitive behavioral therapy will probably be the most common. And that's what I see. So, I mean, what do you think? Would you use it in your practice?
Well, yes, I definitely would. With the job that I have now, I've always recommended parents to do like the parenting classes and engage in programs and so they can see, the positive behaviors and, how they can improve their parenting skills. And for me, I mean, I show like positive behaviors to my clients and to help them teach like how to act in a good way. That would be like one example. Um, but yeah, no, I definitely and I still use it. I think it's a very powerful theory and it does help, the social work field.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think even so that we use some of the social learning theory, not even necessarily like in a practice, but also too when we're working, like for myself with adult foster care, when I'm working with caregivers, like I am modeling and showing them on how to give them the resources and the tools to be able to better care for the person they're caring for, and carrying out their activities of daily living. So I just think like overall social learning theory is a powerful tool, like you said, and it helps people to learn, grow, and make changes through modeling, reinforcement, and environmental changes. And especially where it falls into and aligns with the principles of social work that, to give people the power to be able to have more control and to have better lives. So, yeah, why not? it for today. Oh,
Yay!
yay! Thanks for tuning in to Talk Theory with Jess and
Talita.
a social work student's perspective. If you've enjoyed this episode, be sure to stick around for the remainder of the semester in general practice too, with our wonderful professor, CJ Wright. Thanks again.
Thank you.